My name is Rose Kagawa, and I'm happy to serve as the co-chair of the Science Committee for the Research Conference for the Prevention of Firearm-Related Harms. This video is meant to provide some additional guidance as you prepare your conference submissions, so that you know what presentation types are available to you and what types of projects fit best with each presentation type. It will also explain how submissions are scored, focusing mainly on the scoring of scientific abstracts. However, I will also briefly review the scoring for workshop and symposium submissions at the end of this video. I'd like to start with first thanking you so much for your interest in this conference. We are excited to see and share all of the fantastic research that is happening in this field, and we can't wait to hear more about your work. We're accepting submissions for 5 presentation types: oral sessions, poster sessions, lightning science, which is new this year, workshops, and symposia. You will submit scientific abstracts to the call for oral, lightning science, and poster presentations. There is a single submission form that serves all 3 of these presentation types. In the submission form, you will have an opportunity to indicate which presentation types you would like your scientific abstracts to be considered for. Please note that your abstract will not be considered for presentation types that you do not select. For example, if you indicate that you would like your abstract to be considered only for an oral presentation, then if it's not selected for an oral presentation, it will not be considered for any other presentation formats. I will briefly introduce these formats before describing the scoring rubrics. Abstracts on topics that will be of interest to a broad audience, use rigorous methods, and include impactful results and clear conclusions are well suited to oral presentations. In an oral session, scientific abstracts are grouped by common themes or topics to fill a panel of 5 presentations. Each presentation is up to 12 minutes in length, and then there's time reserved for a few questions after each presentation. In a poster presentation, at least one author displays a visual summary of their study and discusses their work with attendees who browse, ask questions, and engage in more one-on-one or small group conversations. Abstracts focusing on a specialized topic or with results that are preliminary or exploratory are well suited to a poster presentation. Poster presentations are also a great format when the goal is to network and connect one-on-one or in small groups to discuss a scientific study. And the presentation can be more conversational and flexible. We have a new presentation format this year, lightning science. The lightning science presentations are limited to 5 minutes and 4 slides, and they are delivered by one author who highlights only the key points of a study in a quick and engaging format. We would love to see some exemplary work presented in this fashion. Abstracts that describe innovations in measurement, data, and research methods, preliminary or pilot data from research on programs, policies, or practice, or early stage or rapid response studies on emerging or urgent issues would be great for this format. Lightning science presentations are going to be grouped together in a dedicated session with approximately 8 presentations each, and we are excited to see submissions in this format. There are 2 other presentation formats, workshops and symposia, and each of these has their own submission form. Workshops are geared toward instruction and are often methodological or technical in nature with the goal of teaching concrete skills, methods, or practices. These are 60-minute sessions in which the instructors have the freedom to design how best to use that time to engage participants in learning. And then finally, symposia are also 60-minute sessions, but these are focused on a single topic, and the speakers will go in greater depth than an oral session would allow. Speakers summarize the state of the evidence on an important topic in firearm violence prevention research, or present a series of new and related studies on the topic, or discuss an emerging topic, all in greater depth. The scoring for these 2 formats is slightly different than it is for all other scientific abstracts, and I will go over that at the end of this presentation. Each scientific abstract is scored on these 6 categories, and I'll talk through each briefly. As a reminder, abstracts should be no more than 400 words in length, and they should follow the required format with these headings. So background, purpose, methods, approach, results, outcome, and conclusions, implications. For this conference, you must have findings at the time of submitting your abstracts. These findings can be preliminary, but there must be data presented. Please don't submit an abstract that is proposed work, as it just won't be accepted. Each of these sections is scored from 1 to 5, with 1 being low and 5 being high. And each abstract gets a numerical score, which is considered in combination with the submitters and the reviewers' recommendations about the appropriate format for the abstract. The science committee also looks across abstracts and has some discretion in terms of which ones we accept and how we put them all together. Okay, so first we're looking at the background and purpose of the study. Each scored section has guiding questions that are given to reviewers. So A and B here. Is the topic interesting? Does the research question address an important gap in the literature? And so reviewers will consider both these questions and then give this section a single score between 1 to 5. In your background and purpose section, you want to state the objective of the study and make really clear the gap in knowledge that your study addresses. This might be a gap that maybe there's a whole program or a policy that really hasn't received any attention, or it might be a gap in that it's a known problem, but it's being researched in a new setting or a new population. This is the first of 2 questions on methods, and here we're looking at how the study is designed and carried out. This should be clearly described and appropriate for the research question. Keep in mind that while we try to match reviewers with submissions from their field, they may not be familiar with the method you use. So make sure to describe these methods and indicate why you chose them. The reviewers will think about these guiding questions. Is the research approach clearly presented, and is their approach appropriate for a scientifically rigorous evaluation of the research question? And then they will assign a summary score from 1 to 5. We look at analysis separately. And here the questions are, is the analytic approach clear and appropriate? And then, was it executed correctly? So for quantitative studies, that might be, did you use the correct statistical test? And for qualitative studies, that could be, did you use a sound theoretical grounding for the approach? And we recognize that the analytic approach and norms will vary by discipline, and we take this into account when scoring. It is still very helpful if the analytic approach is clearly described and well justified. The reviewers will think about these guiding questions and come up with a summary score from 1 to 5. We then look at the results section. Are they clearly presented? Are they relevant to the research question? And now note here, this is the one section that's a little bit different. It's not just 1 to 5. There's a response option for no results. And so all abstract, and just reminding you, all abstracts are required to have results. And so abstracts that don't have any results presented will receive a 0 and won't be accepted for presentation. However, we totally recognize that studies are often in progress at this stage, and that's totally appropriate. And so you might have partial results or preliminary findings. Those abstracts will be reviewed and considered for acceptance, and we understand that the final presentation will likely include updated results from what's presented in the abstract in those scenarios. The final section of the abstract is the conclusions. Here we're looking to see whether the conclusions are clearly presented and they follow logically from the results that are presented. So you want to avoid overly broad statements like firearm violence is a serious public health problem, and stick more to conclusions or implications that stem directly from the study that you've completed and the addition that they make to the literature. It's also important here that if you are presenting, or if you presented preliminary findings in the results section, your conclusion should be aligned with that stage of your study. So the conclusion should acknowledge that the study is in progress and that the final results and conclusions might differ. And then the last section that we score is on significance. So does this research have the potential to advance the field? And we think about this really broadly. So it might advance a specific area of the field, or it might advance the field more broadly. Null results can be informative and can receive a high score on this section. And in terms of novelty, it might be that the research question is innovative, or it might be that the study design or analytic approach is innovative. If a study is innovative and important in its purpose, it is likely to advance the field. So again, the reviewers will think about each of these guiding questions and provide a single score for this section. I just want to note that the quality of writing has been baked into each of these scoring criteria, right? So each of these things often says, is it presented clearly? And a well-written abstract is important. So please follow the submission guidelines, include all the required headings, make sure it's under 400 words, and make sure it's really clear and easy to understand. Now, reviewers are asked at the end to provide a summary recommendation based on the score that was provided and the fit that they think that this study or presentation might have with different presentation types, so oral, lightning session, or poster. And then we as a committee go back and look at all of these scores and all of these recommendations in terms of where things fit, in addition to the submitters' preferences about their format that they would like to present in. Finally, I want to return to workshops and symposia. As a reminder, these are each submitted specifically to the call of interest, so either workshops or symposia. It's a separate form. And they're scored a little bit differently. For scoring workshops, reviewers focus on the importance and relevance of the topic or skills being taught, how those skills will be taught, thinking about formats that engage the audience in practice or discussion, for example, the learning objectives, and the experience of the speakers with the topic at hand. And then the scoring criteria are very similar for symposia, where the focus again is on the importance and relevance of the topic, but instead of teaching approach, reviewers will assess the scientific rigor of the underlying research that's being presented. And then similarly, reviewers will consider the learning objectives and the direct or relevant experience of the speakers. Happy writing. We look forward to your submissions.
Off. So I'm going to talk for maybe 10 or so minutes about some practical guidance and a practical approach to developing an abstract and writing the abstract. You'll find lots of guidance online. If you want to do some more review after this, I'll just say that this is sort of largely based off of cumulative experience and, quite frankly, a lot of the missteps and a lot of the things that I wish I would have known when I was starting out and writing my first few. Today's really framed around submissions to a specific conference. I'll say that the guidance that I've kind of included in these slides, I've tried to make a little bit agnostic to the conference. This is really general guidance about abstract writing, which of course I hope you can apply to what we're hoping you'll submit to this fall. This I think is the most obvious one, so it's where I started. There might be a time in your career where you're just swimming in data and studies that are ongoing, and you could think a few days or a couple weeks in advance about what you'll be submitting and get it together quickly. That certainly was not the case for me early on. It took a lot of time and effort to get these abstracts to develop. And it wasn't always clear to me what data I would have, whether I would have data or who I would be writing with. And so starting early, as in starting now and today, is I think the right time frame if you're starting to think about writing your first abstracts, start building a team and figure out what that question is going to be. So this week is the time to reach out to colleagues, to mentors, to say, what data do you have? Would you join me in writing this abstract? Will you support me in doing this? Waiting to come up with an idea, for another few weeks is just compressing your timeline, and it is likely to impair sort of the quality of the final work that you submit. Once you have that idea, it's time to do some really practical things and do them early. First of all, as Emmy said, review the instructions. They differ, just as when you're submitting manuscripts, the authors to instructions are sort of painfully different between journals. There's going to be nuances with any different submission, and you've really got to follow the instructions, because if you don't, the reviewers are going to notice that. Understand the length that you're going to have to submit. Different abstracts are going to they're going to have word or character limits. They're going to have characters with or without spaces limits. And I'll tell you, just having been there before, you don't want to show up with a 500 word limit and find that it's 400, which this conference is. And you don't want to show up with the wrong character limit, a few hours before the submission deadline, particularly if you're relying on a mentor to help you make those sort of final changes. Once you've figured out your team, get the affiliations and their financial disclosures and conflicts of interest early. If you wait for the last day to jump into the portal to see if the portal works and to start working through the submission, and it says, is the person you're working with affiliated with this institution, and you don't know what their preferred affiliation is, something that's actually going to get published within the proceedings of a conference, that's a little bit of a last-minute panic that you don't want to have to deal with. Also, think hard and discuss with your team and your mentors about submitting an oral or a poster presentation. I think a lot of people sort of reflexively think that the oral presentation is the better presentation, and so hopefully I'll get that, and if not, I'll get a poster. I'll say that there are different types of interactions that happen in oral presentations and poster presentations, and there are some projects that I will work on which I would rather actually sit in a conference room and have people come by and talk about my poster with me than having spent that time at the podium, which is a different type of engagement and question and answer session with the people who might be interested in my research. So that's a thing to think about early on. So it is really, really my strong belief, and it's really my experience that authentic engagement with your collaborators, your co-authors, is going to make your work a lot better. And to get that type of authentic engagement from your collaborators, it means establishing a process. So once you have an idea of who's on the team and what the project or the writing is going to look like, establish a timeline for yourself. Very early on, let your co-authors know what to expect and when to expect it. I'm going to send you an abstract version. I'm going to send it to you by this date with expected revisions by this date. That allows me, that allows the people you're working with time to block off on their calendar so that they can commit the right amount of effort to helping you get that work across the finish line. How many rounds of revision? I think sometimes when we think, oh, it's just short writing, so if everybody looks at it once, that's great. And again, maybe there's a point in all of our careers where that's the case, but typically speaking, more rounds of revision can actually help improve a work quite a bit, especially once the third person to review it makes a great point that the first and second people hadn't thought of, and they have to go back to take a look at it. So if you have time to build in sort of final approvals or multiple rounds of revision, I think that can really help make sure the abstract is as good as it can be. Knowing when your co-authors are unavailable is really important. This is a July submission timeframe, and a lot of us are going to be on vacation sometime through the June and July months. So as you're establishing that timeline, figure out periods of unavailability and schedule around them. I'll often use calendar invites as reminders. So, hey, I told everybody I'm going to send out the first round for comments on June 21st. I'll send them all a calendar invite just as a reminder, not as a meeting, so that pops up on their calendar. And in this day and age, really using Google Docs, Microsoft Teams, SharePoint, whatever it is, so that people can asynchronously make edits to a document without passing it back and forth between email, I think really helps with version control and making sure that when somebody is reviewing your abstract, they're actually building off of the comments that was left before them. So I really recommend using that type of technology. So what about the writing? I think it's a normal kind of reaction to say, hey, it's 400 words. Like I can do that really quickly. This isn't a 3,500 word manuscript. And there's a lot of different quotes from a lot of different writers who speak directly to this sort of cognitive trap. And I think Mark Twain said it pretty well. The point is to tell a story, like a really full story, and do it efficiently is a real challenge. It's a puzzle that takes effort to put together. And so when you sit down to start writing and you've got the headings that Emmy shared with you, and it'll be different by different conferences that you're going to submit to, are you going to try and aim for 400 words as you write? Or are you going to write long and trim down to that 400 words at the end? And now everybody has a different approach to this. And so you have to figure out what works best for you. But what I usually suggest to writers in their first few abstracts and papers is to write long. Write long. Include the details that you think you need to include in that abstract or that paper. By including more detail, you're less likely to leave out important elements of the final work. And then by trimming, by getting more efficient in your writing, by taking words out, by making hard decisions about what actually should stay, what actually shouldn't stay, I think really gets you to a higher quality work. So if it works within your writing style, I would say write long and then get down to 400 words. In terms of the content, you can't summarize all the elements of a 300 or a 3,000 word paper in one abstract. And that's okay, because that's not the point and that's not what's expected. What is the most important thing that you need to communicate into your work? What do you want somebody really to take away from the abstract that you wrote, from the presentation that you're going to give at the national conference? How complex are the methods, and how much nuance is required to communicate those methods, and how much of it can be left out? And then how familiar is the topic of the content area? Now, a lot of this is really about sort of knowing where you're submitting. If you're submitting to, say, a general medical conference, well, it might be important to highlight an obvious phrase like firearm injuries or a public health problem. If you're submitting to a conference that's focused wholly on firearm-related harms, it's unlikely you need to start off an introduction with a statement such as firearm injuries are a public health problem. It's not that the statement is wrong, it's just that you're in a setting in which everybody is clearly going to come to the table already knowing that and believing that, and so you're using that sentence in a way that could be used to distribute or used to be dedicated to other more important content within your abstract. There are some practical things to consider, such as using active or passive voice. I won't weigh in on this. I will say that this varies quite a bit by discipline. It will vary by journal. It will vary by conference. It's important to do, I think, two things. First, refer to the instructions and see if the instructions offer you guidance on the type of language or voice that you're supposed to use, and just be consistent, right? Don't shift back and forth between active and passive voice without your writing, because it is harder for readers to consume the information if you're switching back and forth between writing styles. Similar sort of to that, pay attention to the format of your sentences. Keep them as simple as you can make them. Use parallel structure when you can. I'll ask you, which of these statements is easier to process? Particularly if you were to think about reading them embedded in a longer paragraph of similarly worded findings, or it's being reviewed by somebody who's less familiar with the content area. For example, the prevalence of firearm ownership was higher in Group B than in Group A, and was higher in Group C than Group A. Or, in comparison to Group A, the prevalence of firearm ownership was higher in both Group B and Group C. Or, compared to Group A, the prevalence of firearm ownership was higher in both Group B and Group C. Or, compared to Group A, the prevalence of firearm ownership was higher in Groups B and C. Now, this might seem, I think, a little bit trivial, but once you get to the point where you're reviewing a lot of abstracts, the cognitive burden, the cognitive ease of reviewing can really impact, I think, subconsciously how you interpret somebody's work. And so keeping the same structure of sentences, keeping them simple and efficient throughout, makes it easier not only to read and to get through the review process, but also to interpret new information, particularly unfamiliar information, as you work your way through an abstract. I'll also say there's also practical reasons to think about this, that if you just think about the character count between the first sentence that I presented there and the fourth, that's a way to actually trim down your character count and fit more important information into your abstract. So most journals and conferences are not going to give you specific word or character limits on the different sections of the abstract. I'll just say generally, some would say there's this thing called the 1-2-2-1 rule, and I'm not going to say this is a rule. I'm not going to recommend it. And what people will often mean by that is that if you just kind of look at those blocks of color there that I presented on the screen, the introduction and the final discussion section are about half the length of the methods and the results. And the point of sort of pointing that out is that it really takes a lot more in an abstract to talk about the methods and the results than, for instance, the introduction. And so think about the amount of information that you really need to provide a reviewer to understand your work. both in terms of the background and in terms of the methods and the results. In almost all cases, those methods and results are going to be, they're going to require more content and more space of the abstract to communicate that information. I want to point out one of the most common mistakes that I see in abstract writing, and it's, is there information in the introduction that you didn't address later on? Is there a result presented that you did not discuss methods for? Is there a conclusion or a discussion point that you made at the end of your abstract in which you don't have results to actually substantiate or support those claims? It's really important to know that throughout a really brief abstract, all of the pieces should align in some way. If you're going to present methods for something, you should present results for it, and vice versa. This can often be the result of trimming. So if you do what I said earlier and you write long and you start with a 600-word abstract, and then you make hard decisions about making your sentences more efficient and cutting out maybe parts of the results section or parts of the methods section, if you don't go back and ask yourself this question, is there something here that wasn't there? Then oftentimes you'll find that you've actually included information that's not substantiated elsewhere in the abstract. So always go back and make sure, does this sentence make sense within the context of the rest of the things that I presented? Scrutinize your language. This is something that I've tried to get better at time, and I'm still not obviously great at it, but thinking hard about the words that you include can be a really important thing to do, and it can really, I think, make the difference between a good and a great abstract. How many times in 2024 did we use the word elucidate in common language, right? If you can use simpler words such as use rather than utilize, then why not do it? If it's easier for me to understand as a reviewer, if it's simpler to read, and if it saves me character count. Does the word indeed actually offer anything to this sentence whatsoever, or is it an unnecessary addition? Why say as well as when you can say and? Why say due to the fact to when you could just say because? Again, these are common things that we'll use in language from day to day, but in scientific writing, you can go back before you submit your manuscript or your abstract and say, is there a more efficient way for me to communicate this part of the sentence? Avoiding technical language and jargon, I think, is really important. When I first started writing, I was really intimidated. And I was intimidated because I couldn't read most papers, right? I didn't know a lot about the methods. I really didn't know a lot about the background information. Everybody seemed to be using fancier words than me. And so I felt the pressure to use those fancier words. And what I've come to learn more and more over time is the simpler you can make the language, the better the abstract is going to be reviewed and the more people are going to take from it. There are certainly some cases where we have to use technical language and jargon because that's maybe commonly understood in our field, or it's the most efficient way, or it's the only way to communicate a certain concept. But in certain cases, that's just not it. And if you can find a simpler, easy way to write something, there's really no reason not to do it. And lastly, proofread. Please proofread. Emmy mentioned this. I'm going to repeat it. Look, we all have typos and grammatical errors that we introduce in our documents, right? And as a reviewer, it's really my responsibility not to get bent out of shape if I see, a minor typo within an abstract submission. I think that's really important. Having said that, I'm not sure that's the case for all reviewers. And second of all, if you have multiple typos or grammatical errors within a single 400-word abstract, I begin to start thinking, well, what else wasn't this writer paying attention to when they submitted this, and what errors do I really have to consider that they might have put into their work that aren't so apparent to me? So proofread in the end, given the new software available to do that, there's really no excuse not to. And I want to leave you just a last thought before I pass you off. Research is difficult, and the careers come with like really cool wins and acceptances, but all of us have lots and lots and lots of rejections. And there are a lot of factors that contribute to whether an abstract is accepted, whether it is accepted as a specific presentation format, for example, an oral versus a poster session. So just know that given all these factors, some things just don't get accepted for presentation, and that's kind of part of a research career, I would say. But persistence is really, really important. So take that abstract, ask yourself, ask your team hard questions about, do we know why it didn't get accepted? Could we have done better? And then find another place to resubmit it. So this is a really great conference. I love this conference more than any others I attend, but there are lots of good venues to present this type of work. So don't give up and give up on a publication or a line on your CV if you submit and it's not accepted. But I hope you can take some of this guidance and produce a high quality abstract. And I think Dr. Rahani Wabar is going to talk about that next. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Joe. Thanks everyone for being here. Really appreciate your time. We thought it would be good to maybe actually show an abstract and go through it together and see what pieces, catch your eyes or attention, or you think we can do better. I have some comments I'm going to show you. So before I share my screen, the study is about people who get shot, people who are shot and they end up in the hospital. They're hospitalized with a firearm injury. And the question is, what is the risk of their getting shot again or dying by firearm injury once they are released from the hospital? So that's essentially the question that this abstract is trying to tackle. And please let me know if you can't see the screen or you have any difficulty. You should be able to see the abstract. So one of the first things that comes to mind is just the title of your submission. This is called Risk of Subsequent Firearm-Related Harm Among Patients Hospitalized for a Firearm Injury. To the extent that you could make the title of your presentation, your abstract, your submission more specific to distinguish it from others would be great. I don't think the title can be comprehensive to really cover and encompass everything that you have done. That would probably just be unnecessary and tedious for a title to be that long. But also it would be good to have some distinction from other abstracts that may be submitted. So firearm-related harm is a very broad term. There are hundreds of different types of firearm-related harm. This study, as I just mentioned, only measured firearm-related injury and death. Those are just two types of firearm-related harm. And so maybe you would like to make it a little bit more specific in terms of, well, this was a study of firearm-related injury or firearm-related death. So let's take a look at the background and purpose. They mentioned that firearm-related harm is a significant public health and safety problem in the US. I think for this conference, probably you don't need that. The whole conference is about firearm-related harm and prevention of that. You can save some precious words right there, following what Joe mentioned. And so it seems perhaps unnecessary. Risk for firearm violent victimization after firearm-related hospitalization, FRH, must be determined to inform future intervention. And they mentioned that they try to compare the risk of subsequent violent injury and deaths among patients with firearm-related hospitalization with those hospitalized for non-injury reasons like infectious diseases, lung diseases, or respiratory diseases, non-injury reasons. What is lacking here seems to be a very clear articulation of what is novel here, what's innovative here, what's the research gap that they try to address. What do we know about this topic to the extent possible? Without making it too wordy, it would be good to talk about that and really sharply put the lens on that knowledge gap that this submission tries to address. And I also think, as you're focusing on background and purpose here, when you narrow it down to firearm-related outcomes, perhaps there seems to be less justification for going back again and make it broad about all types of violent injury and death. So once you narrow it down to firearm-related outcome, and that's what you're studying, it would be best to just mention that this was a study of firearm-related violent injury and death after hospital discharge among people who were hospitalized for a firearm-related hospitalization in the first place. Now, just looking at this with the, taking a step back and just looking at all these sections, and hopefully you can see all of that on your screen, right off the bat, perhaps you can find something based on what Joe just mentioned, is that the methods and approach section seems to be a little bit lacking of information, just seems too short. Again, not to measure or give a weight or necessarily judge an abstract based on the lengths of these different parts, but it's clear that the method seems to be lacking some details. So they mentioned that patients with an FRH and a random sample of those with a non-injury related hospitalizations were included, and primary outcome included subsequent firearm-related hospitalization and firearm-related death. Proportional hazards regression models were conducted. So we don't know what the design is. The study design is pretty important to give the reader an understanding of the architecture of what this is. It's very different if this is a case control study, a cohort study, a randomized trial, a quasi-experimental study. This is a survey, qualitative, quantitative, mixed methods. Whatever that is, the architecture of the investigation, it would be important to mention that. Where? We don't know. When? We don't know. This is one of the most common missing components I have seen in abstracts, because sometimes we get really focused on some of the technical aspects of the research and methodology, and then we forgot that we actually didn't even include any information about, let's say, calendar year. What was it? When was the calendar year this data was collected or this study was done? Is this using data that are already old from many years ago, maybe for good justification, or it was a recent study? So do not forget to include when. Do not forget to include where. That's really important. Now, sometimes we can't necessarily name, let's say, a particular hospital for reasons that are justifiable, but it would be good to give the reader some understanding of the setting. We don't have information on how were these things measured. How were the exposure or outcome were measured? These are based on clinical records. These are based on interviews. These are based on claims data. How were they actually measured, and what is the source of these different measures? We really don't know. And also, when for a quantitative abstract like this that I'm showing, but also it could be for qualitative, doesn't really matter. Whatever the methodology is, some specificity in terms of how the analysis was done is helpful. So when we say proportional hazard regression model were conducted for this study, really you want to get a better sense of were the covariates in the model or not, what were those covariates to the extent that your space allows. That would be really great. This applies to qualitative approaches and qualitative methodology as well. Just having maybe a couple more sentences to mention some of the specific aspects of how you ran the analysis would be really, really helpful. In the results section, they start by saying among patients with an index firearm-related hospitalization, we never saw the word index. Do you see any word index before? You don't. This just came completely out of nowhere. Now, for the writer, for the authors, this perhaps is very obvious and intuitive, like index means the first one. But we didn't introduce this term before. It came out of nowhere. And so your reader may be confused about what is this? What is index? What do you mean by index? And so don't introduce new terms, as Dr. Simonetti mentioned, in the results section or anywhere after the method section if you haven't really defined what that term really means. So this is really important. The other missing piece in this results section is just simple counts. Simple counts are important. How many patients are we talking about? Is this a study of 10 people, 20 people, 100,000 people? We don't know. That's really important to mention some counts, just simple counts. Provide descriptives. Descriptives are powerful. Sometimes there is this stigma against description, which I think is very misplaced. Description is key, is the building block of everything you say is description. Provide the reader with an understanding of what are those counts? How many people are there? What's the sample size? Qualitative or quantitative? Doesn't matter. That's important. They mentioned that after providing incidence rate, they mentioned patients with an index firearm-related hospitalization were at greater risk for subsequent firearm-related hospitalization and death compared to those with non-injury reasons that were hospitalized. Fine. But then what they provide here is HR. What is HR? The authors know this is hazard ratio. Does everybody know this is hazard ratio? Absolutely not. And so because an acronym is familiar to you in your field, in your domain, don't assume that people know what those are, even if it's absolutely obvious. I've had examples where people have provided CI, assuming that, well, it's obvious, CI is confidence interval. But some people got confused. They thought it was cumulative incidence. So don't assume that the acronyms that you know, everybody knows. If you have point estimates like this, provide confidence interval, provide some element of precision. That's really important to tell your reader how precise some of these estimates are. They mentioned compared with the general population, standardized incidence ratio was this and that. Where did that come from? We never talked about a comparison with the general population. The entire thing was about comparing patients who had been shot versus patients who had not sustained an injury. Where does general population come from? True, it's very, very helpful to know, but we never said anything about it, either in the introduction as a question or methodology. How did we even calculate a standardized incidence ratio? Where did that come from? So it's important to mention where that came from. This map, one-to-one map between results and methods that Dr. Simonetti mentioned is absolutely critical to make sure that your reader can follow. And then they mention in the conclusions and implications section, hospitalization for firearm-related injuries associated with a heightened risk for subsequent firearm violent victimization, hospital-based interventions delivered among survivors of firearm-related injury are an important strategy to reduce the toll of firearm-related harm. As important as hospital-based violence intervention and HVIP programs are, this is not a study that examined the effectiveness of HVIPs. It didn't. Perhaps it provided the building block to put the lens on the fact that people who have been shot when they are released from the hospital, they constitute a group that we do need to have attention. We need to provide resources. We need to think about quality of care, not only physical care, but also mental and psychological health and all of that. But this study was not an effectiveness evaluation of HVIPs. Maybe instead of saying that last sentence that they are an important strategy, it would be better to say this study provides important information in terms of exploring and devising and designing hospital-based violence intervention programs that may translate into sizable population impact. But it's just as a suggestion, not a definitive statement about how effective these programs are. So this is just a made up abstract from one of my own work from almost a decade ago that I changed. But I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. I'm sure every abstract is different. Sometimes you may write an abstract because you're a law scholar, so it's an abstract related to law and legal scholarship or philosophy or engineering. So it may look very different from what I have presented here, which is sort of a more traditional health sciences type of empiric study. But some of these elements and principles I just described hopefully apply to a variety of different types of abstracts that you may write based on your own domain. And so with that, I'm gonna let Dr. Jones take it from here.
Thank you for the segue, and thank you for the opportunity to present today. Again, my name is Christian Jones. I am an assistant professor in the School of Social Work and have the privilege of being a part of FIPRP at UW. I'm really happy to talk to you all today. I'm just going to go over some high-level, frequently asked questions that we often get about the conference, and also talk very briefly about when you might think about submitting a workshop for the conference. So if you have a topic that you're really passionate about and feel like other researchers and practitioners and your colleagues in this space, in this research area could really benefit from having tangible skills to address. So for example, I've presented a workshop on best practices to conduct community engaged research because I've found that to be quite difficult the last few years. So had the privilege to present with some really incredible community partners I've made in Seattle and King County area. So that was a topic that I felt like other researchers have a lot of issues with. It's really rewarding to do community engaged research, but takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. So if you have a topic like that that you're thinking about that other people could really benefit from learning from, then maybe you should consider submitting a workshop either instead of or in addition to an oral presentation as well. Oral papers are all about presenting research findings, as Dr. Betts mentioned earlier, but workshops are all about hands-on training. So think of these as just professional development trainings that you're providing to the field on a variety of different topics that are addressing a gap. So it could be a workshop focused on statistical modeling and violence prevention interventions. It could be a workshop focused on how to handle missing data and collecting primary data in this area. The research is tied into the workshop, obviously, but again, this is all about professional development that you're providing to your colleagues in the field to address a really relevant gap in this research area. So please don't just present your research for 90 minutes. Minutes, but instead, this is just training that you're providing to your colleagues across the field to address a critical gap to make research easier to just conduct this life-saving work that everyone is doing. So I'm going to really quickly go through 12 questions that are commonly asked when submitting proposals. So if I go through this pretty fast, I'm happy to answer any questions in the Q&A. Just want to make sure that there's enough time left for Q&A. And our incredible presenters actually answered a lot of these questions as we were going through the presentation. Just want to reiterate some things. From what disciplines are abstracts encouraged from? All of them. We don't discriminate. I'm in social work. Dr. Rohani's in public health and medicine. Um, we encourage submissions from all over the place, whether it's criminology, education, whether you're focused on community violence, intimate partner violence, school shootings. All of this work is incredibly important now more than ever. So no matter what your topic is, as long as it's something related to some type of firearm violence, you're highly encouraged to apply. And we're also really interested in research along the translational spectrum as well. So law reviews, primary prevention to policy work, all of that stuff is great. So please don't be discouraged if you're not in a field that you see commonly represented. We encourage all disciplines to apply to the conference. Can I submit multiple abstracts for consideration? Absolutely. There's no limits on the amount of abstracts you can submit or the numbers of submissions that you can present on. Just know that if you get accepted for 5 oral presentations, you're expected to present all 5 times. So do be mindful of that. How many presenting authors or co-authors can be included in my abstract? There is no limits on the co-authors who can contribute to the presentation. However, you do have to kind of pick a lead singer for the presentation. There's only one person who can be the presenting author, and we only have one space at the presenting table for that presenting author. So if people on the research team really want to present, you all can fit it within the allotted time limit and they feel comfortable sitting in the audience, they're more than welcome to present. But be mindful that it just might be easier for your research team if you limit the amount of co-authors to those who've really substantially contributed to the study. I'm interested I'm interested in submitting an abstract about a proposed study. Can it be considered for inclusion in a conference program? No. Quick answer to that. As Dr. Vet said earlier, we're only looking for abstracts of proposed research. We are not looking for proposed research projects, only stuff with findings. Preliminary findings are okay, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But no proposed research projects, please. My study has produced no results. Would that disqualify my abstract? Absolutely not. Non-significant findings, no findings are incredibly important, not just findings that are significant. So as long as the research is sound, the research question is great, the methods and conclusions look good, we welcome all submissions regardless of that outcome. What if my research does not have findings by the abstract deadline, but will have findings by the conference? Again, we highly, highly, highly encourage you all to have some type of preliminary findings by the time of submission. So even if you just need a few weeks from now to gain those findings, that's completely okay. But we won't accept any proposed research projects. Do I have to register or pay registration fees for the conference if my abstract is accepted? Short answer, yes. Presenting authors will be required to register and pay the registration costs. And all accepted submissions are expected to present in person. There's no virtual option at this time. Can I submit an abstract that has already been submitted and slash or accepted at another convention or conference? The short answer is no. And the key word here is prior to submission to this conference. That means you can submit an abstract that has been submitted for publications or has been submitted to another conference at the time of the submission. You can also submit an abstract for something that's being considered for publication, but it can't have already been published or presented anywhere else. Can my abstract include work that is about to be submitted for publication and may our date for it be published prior to the conference presentation? Absolutely. That is completely okay, just as long as it's prior to the submission deadline for this conference. Can I submit the same abstract for consideration across all presentation categories? Absolutely. Go for it. Would a science committee proofread my abstract before including it as part of the conference program? No. Unfortunately, we do not have the capacity to do that. And we highly encourage that you all use spell check, proofread a couple times before submitting because your abstract will be reproduced as it's submitted. And then lastly, if an abstract is rejected, are the reasons for rejection provided to the author who submitted it? Unfortunately, that's also a no, because the science committee doesn't have the capacity to do so. We highly, highly, highly encourage you all to take advantage of office hours and be able to walk through these different questions you may have before submission to gain any insight, feedback that might be helpful for the submission process. So have
This question about what does significance mean? Thank you, Jason, for asking the question. I think this is your opportunity to convince the reviewer why it's significant. It may be that it's just that you figured out a really cool new method that's never been tried before. That's significant, but you have to make the case and the person reading it needs to understand why. So don't say significant because it's going to change societal views about guns. Probably not, right? But you have the opportunity to explain why this particular work is important or significant. Then there was also a question about the use of AI. We don't have any specific guidelines saying that you cannot use AI in creating an abstract. I really, really, just encourage you, especially for those of you who are earlier in your career, get good at doing this yourself. I think AI is a helpful tool for tweaking things sometimes, maybe in other settings, but a 400-word abstract is not that long, and I think you have to be really careful about it misrepresenting what you're truly trying to say. And I think it's a space where a shortcut may end up not benefiting you. Reviewers are not allowed to use AI in their review process. Sophia, thank you for the question. Systematic reviews allowed. Yes, systematic reviews are a type of study. So you would follow the same approach for the abstract and make the case as to why it's important. And systematic reviews do have their own set of methodology that you want to make sure you're referencing. Submissions are open to non-academics. I would say this is a research conference, though, and so we are expecting to see study methodologies, data, et cetera. I would really encourage you, if you're from a different discipline, community organization, maybe not an academic, encourage you to come to some of the office hours to get some specific feedback. I don't mean to be the only one answering all these questions. If anyone's got suggestions.